As you know, here at Unreal True Crime, we release videos every other day. Many of you have reached out expressing a desire for daily content, so we've launched a new channel also focused on real-life crime stories called The Crime Storyteller. On the days we don't post videos on Unreal True Crime, we'll upload them there. This means if you're looking for daily doses of the most astonishing real-life crime cases, don't hesitate to subscribe. Without further ado, let's dive into today's case. Ayla Reynolds was born on April 4, 2010 in Waterville, a city in the state of Maine, United States. She was a beautiful girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and an irresistible smile. She loved music and dancing to the rhythm of her favorite songs. Her parents, Trista Reynolds and Justin DiPietro, were not a couple but had known each other for a long time. They had a brief romance in the summer of 2009, resulting in Trista getting pregnant. The news was particularly surprising for Justin, who had no intention of having a child with Trista and even doubted he was the father. When Trista gave birth to Ayla, the resemblance to Justin was undeniable, but he still refused to acknowledge her as his daughter. A paternity test in July 2010 finally made him accept his parenthood. Consequently, in December of the same year, he was ordered by Child Protective Services to provide child support. Trista and Justin didn't have a court-approved custody agreement. However, Trista, who lived in Portland, had the primary physical custody of Ayla thanks to an arrangement between them. It was only in mid-2011, after Ayla's first birthday, that Justin started having visits with her. He lived an hour and a half away, and the encounters were meant to be during the day and very brief. They agreed that he could occasionally take Ayla with him, but never overnight. In the months following Ayla's birth, Trista became pregnant again, this time by her fiancé Raymond. Thus, in 2011, Ayla became the elder sister to Raymond Jr., and Trista managed the care of both children. Everything changed on October 13, 2011, when Trista had an encounter with Child Protective Services. The details of the complaint that led to this meeting are not clear, but it was known that Trista had a substance abuse problem. That day, officials gave her an ultimatum: overcome her addiction or lose her children. Immediately, Trista entered a 10-day rehabilitation program and left her children in the care of her mother and sister. Ayla and Raymond were her world, and she was determined not to lose them. By October 2011, Justin had seen Ayla approximately 5 to 10 times. However, just 4 days after Trista's internment on October 17th, Justin and his family decided they wanted custody of Ayla. Justin's mother, Phoebe DiPietro, contacted Child Protective Services and received approval to take Ayla. The official call to inform Trista's relatives about the agency's decision came swiftly. When Ayla's aunt heard that they had to hand over Ayla, she criticized the decision, claiming that Justin was abusive and had harmed the child in the past. The officials argued that a father has more rights to custody than an aunt. Once permission was granted, Justin and his family went to pick up Ayla, but they did not know the address. The child protection officials provided the location through the police. Officer Charles Weaver accompanied Justin and his mother to Jessica's house, Ayla's aunt. The paternal grandmother waited in the car while Justin and the police officer went to the door, leading to a dramatic scene. Jessica implored the officer not to take the child away and warned that she wouldn't give up Ayla willingly. The officer noted that Ayla was in good spirits. She was incessantly laughing, playing, and even trying to initiate conversation. To demonstrate her point, Jessica, Trista's sister, told the officer to observe how Ayla's behavior changed when Justin appeared. At that moment, he had just approached, and seeing him, Ayla immediately started to cry and tried to distance herself. Despite this, the officer took the child and handed her to her father. Ayla was struggling and screaming and even attempted to bite the officer when she was placed in Justin's arms. Ayla's aunt told Officer Charles that Ayla was terrified of her father and that they couldn't take the child away. Charles explained that if it were his decision, he wouldn't let Ayla go with Justin, but it wasn't up to him. He was there to enforce the directive from Child Services. It's crucial to clarify that if Justin had wanted primary physical custody of Ayla, he would have had to reach an agreement with the child's mother or otherwise undergo a judicial process to obtain a judge's approval. As we saw in the custody exchange we just recounted, there was neither an agreement nor a court involved. What was applied was the judgment of a Child Protective Services supervisor. What the official did not consider were the arrangements made by the mother herself, who had full custody for the child to remain in the care of her relatives during her temporary absence. On the other hand, before a court grants a parent exclusive physical custody of a child, usually the conditions are thoroughly evaluated, including a background check and a home visit, which did not occur in Ayla's case. In essence, in custody procedures, the child's best interest must prevail, but reportedly, no report was found to support the adopted decision. In analyses published about Ayla's case, it was believed that only the presence of imminent danger threatening the child's safety could outweigh the stability and continuity provided by staying with her maternal relatives. In this sense, it could be thought that Child Protective Services officials believed the child was at risk. If that had been the case, it is not justified that the measure was applied only to Ayla and not to her little brother Raymond. The father took the girl to his childhood home in Waterville, where he lived with his 47-year-old mother, Phoebe, his 24-year-old sister, Elisha, and her daughter, Gabriella, who, like Ayla, was a baby. At that time, Justin, 25, occupied the partially finished basement, a single large room, while the rest of the family lived upstairs. During the time spent in rehabilitation, Trista called Justin every day to speak with Ayla and ensure everything was all right. In these contexts, she perceived no warning signs. On October 20th, 2011, coinciding with the 8th day of Trista's treatment, there was a meeting to discuss Ayla's case attended by Child Protective Services members, 2 doctors, Trista and her sister Jessica, who were accompanied by a lawyer, and Justin, who participated by phone. This encounter resulted in an agreement. Ayla would be returned to her mother on October 22, 2011, as soon as Trista completed the addiction recovering program. It was also agreed that Justin would bring Ayla to the treatment center on the 21st for a visit. Everything was going well for Trista, but the situation would soon change. None of the established agreements were fulfilled. Desperate to regain her daughter, Trista repeatedly called Child Protective Services for help to enforce the agreement made in their presence. Since she could not get anywhere with Child Protective Services, she sought a temporary agreement with Justin. He would continue to keep the child, and she would have regular visits. On November 12, 2011, Justin took the girl to an emergency room. After conducting the pertinent studies, the doctors determined that the little girl had a broken bone in one of her joints. Specifically, the broken bone was in the joint that connects the elbow to the upper arm. Justin told the doctor that the accident had occurred the previous night on November 11th. According to his account, it was raining, and he slipped and fell on her while on the porch with Ayla in his arms. He added that, although she had cried, she didn't seem to be injured, and it wasn't evident until the next morning that she required urgent medical attention. By the following Monday, The orthopedist considered that surgery wouldn't be necessary and that the injury would likely heal on its own. A week later, on November 26th, during her third medical appointment to assess the child's progress, the specialist said things were going as planned. Trista was present at that medical consultation to closely follow her daughter's recovery, never thinking that this would be the last time she would hold her in her arms. From that moment, things spiraled. Tired of arguing over the custody of her daughter, over visitations, and even over her right to talk to the child on the phone, the mother decided to take a step forward. On December 15, 2011, she filed papers in court to initiate legal proceedings to obtain full physical custody of Ayla. Just 2 days later, on Saturday, December 17th, Justin called the police in the morning to report Ayla's disappearance from his mother's house, where he was staying with his girlfriend, Courtney Roberts, and his sister, Elisha. He assured them that they had put the 20-month-old girl to bed the night before, and when they woke up, she was gone. Early that morning, Trista had started a car trip to a coastal city in Maine, just 50 miles from the Canadian border, to visit her boyfriend Raymond, who had just entered a correctional facility after being convicted of arson. She was dozing in the passenger seat while her father-in-law, Robert Fortier, drove. Robert answered a call from Trista's father, informing him that Ayla was missing. The news left him frozen, and he looked for a suitable place to stop the vehicle and wake Trista. Still drowsy, she heard her father's voice and managed to understand that her baby's whereabouts were unknown. Desperate, Trista changed her course to meet the police who were searching for her little daughter. The journey lasted an hour and a half, but for Trista, it seemed like an eternity. Throughout the trip, she frantically called Justin to find out what had happened, terrified at the lack of response. Even upon arriving at the police station, both Trista and her fiancé's father gave statements. About 30 minutes later, Trista's father joined them at the police headquarters, angry and very distressed. As it transpired, Justin had called 911 that morning at 8:49 to report the disappearance. He said the last time someone saw Ayla was the previous night around 10 p.m., when his sister Elisha checked on her before going to bed. On Saturday morning, they discovered she had disappeared from her crib, but he didn't specify the time in the call. Justin's theory was that the minor had been kidnapped by an unknown intruder. The news of the minor's disappearance spread like wildfire, and the authorities wasted no time initiating an operation. Police chief spoke to the media, stating that the case was being aggressively investigated and that their goal was to find Ayla at all costs. The police proceeded to search the house for any clues that could lead them to the minor. To facilitate operations, the family stayed with friends. At the same time, a command center was established to coordinate the search operation. On the second day, Sunday, December 18th, search dogs were deployed, and the area around the house where Ayla was last seen was searched. Trista's home also underwent a meticulous search, during which the distressed woman had to stay with her mother and younger son in a motel. Trista's father found it exceedingly difficult to sit idle, as Ayla was the apple of his eye. On the third day, Monday, December 19th, the FBI was requested to assist in the search. By this time, 75 individuals from various agencies were involved in the operation. The Maine State Police seized 2 vehicles from the Di Pietro residence. One, a 1996 Ford Explorer, belonged to Justin. The other, a 4-door silver sedan, was owned by Justin's girlfriend Courtney, who was also present on the night of the disappearance. From day one, local newspapers echoed the news the following morning. Headlines in print media were already covering the story, and 72 hours later, Trista could be seen in interviews with different local news outlets. She did not hesitate to point towards Justin. By the end of the first week, the Today Show, one of the most successful morning news programs in the United States, highlighted the news. There, Trista insisted that her daughter's father was the only one who could answer her questions, as he was the last to see her alive. On the evening of the fourth day, Justin made his first statement to the media. He appeared calm, as if the disappearance hadn't occurred while the child was under his care. He claimed to have no idea what happened to Ayla and stated he wouldn't make accusations or insinuations until the police determined who was responsible for the disappearance. He also announced that he and his family would do everything possible to aid the investigation and secure his daughter's return. During his statement, Justin acknowledged that Ayla was under his exclusive custody at the time of her disappearance, but he lied, stating that this was achieved through an agreement with the mother. Moreover, he added that Trista was incapable of taking care of the child. As days passed, the search efforts widened. The FBI's child abduction rapid deployment team canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door. They repeatedly interviewed neighbors, hoping to uncover some revealing details. The police emphasized the significant effort underway, seeing only commitment and energy from the 75 officers dedicated to resolving the case. Until the 10th day after Justin's complaint, it was estimated that 5,000 hours of work had been invested in the search, and 330 leads were being followed. The operation also involved around 50 civilian volunteers from the Search and Rescue Association. A reward of $30,000 was offered to anyone who could provide a lead that would help in recovering Ayla. Trista remained steadfast in her efforts to find her beloved daughter. The grieving mother was determined in her fight to keep everyone focused on the case. She worked with allies and support groups to organize vigils, marches, and events in memory of Ayla. News cameras were always present, and she, along with other spokespeople, offered new topics to journalists to keep the story on the front page and in the nation's mind. Gradually, the initially optimistic and hopeful message from the authorities started changing. The chief of police continued to insist that the investigation was being considered a missing person case and not a homicide. However, the mood definitively shifted when Justin's house and the surrounding area were cordoned off. The cars were confiscated, and the head of the main criminal prosecution made a public appearance. The police publicly ruled out the possibility of Ayla having walked away on her own, and on the 13th day, the police chief handed over the reins of the case to the State Police Serious Crime Unit. At that moment, an announcement nobody wanted to hear was made. The case ceased being the search for a missing girl and started being considered a criminal investigation. During the initial days, Justin tried to stay as far away from the media as possible, but gradually his presence began to become more frequent. In one of his appearances on the Today Show, he spoke about the change in the message from the law enforcement agencies, insisted that someone had kidnapped Ayla, and expressed his wish for whoever took her to return her home. He also asserted that he had come on the program hoping to reach whoever had his daughter to let them know that what they were doing was wrong. As if he knew the person in question, he spoke directly to them, saying they might think what they were doing was right for Ayla, but it wasn't. He clarified that this person had no right because they weren't her father, and that the child needed to be at home with her family. When questioned about the silence he had maintained until that point, Justin acknowledged that his efforts to cooperate had been delayed. He justified himself by stating that he had been a bit naive during the first weeks, thinking that Ayla would return. He also claimed that the law enforcement agencies had advised him to stay away from the press. This was partially confirmed by the spokesperson for the Maine Department of Public Safety, who explained that this was only said to him at the beginning. Later, the police themselves encouraged Ayla's parents to remain in the public eye. Justin took the opportunity to respond directly to the insinuations that had been made about him. He asked the television host to come see him and spend a day with him to witness what he was going through. Finally, he said that he praised the police's efforts, although some of the techniques and tactics they had to use had not been enjoyable. He pointed out that the truth is the truth. No matter how many times you are asked the same question and shouted at that you are a liar, anticipating that the truth is patient and would come to light. By the end of January, the police revealed that Ayla's blood had been found in various places in the DiPietro house. It also emerged that, while there was not enough evidence to make any arrests, Justin, Courtney, and Elisha, the three adults living in the residence where the girl was last seen, were considered suspects. Stephen McCausland, the spokesperson for the Maine Department of Public Safety, said that the family's version of events was not supported by any forensic evidence, thereby ruling out the possibility that someone could have entered the bedroom where Ayla slept alone and taken her without any of the three adults in the house noticing. 6 months after Ayla's disappearance was reported, on May 30th, 2012, the police said that it was unlikely that the little girl was alive. Trista's family allowed journalists into their home as they watched the press conference where this news was announced. Trista immediately broke into tears. Then her sorrow turned to rage, and she asserted that Justin had killed her baby. For Trista's family, learning in detail the results of some forensic tests conducted at Justin's family's house was very hard. They knew Ayla's blood was found and had even been told that the amount found was equivalent to 25% of the blood volume of her body. However, they had never been in front of the evidence until January 2013, when everything discovered was revealed to them. To begin with, Justin's 1996 Ford Explorer had a baby seat in the back, and Ayla's blood was found on the left shoulder strap. There was also dried gastric fluid on the back seats. In the girl's bedroom, blood was found on some of her princess, pink sneakers on the floor next to her crib, as well as on the face and arms of her doll. The investigators thought that she might have tried to clean the blood from her mouth with her toy. Additionally, a blood stain was located on the living room sofa. However, most of the blood traces were in the basement. A pool of Ayla's blood stained the center of the mattress on which Justin slept with Courtney. Moreover, vomit and an unidentified pink fiber resembling hair that could be from a toy were found on the bed. Next to the same piece of furniture were Justin's sneakers stained with Ayla's blood on the tongue and inside. Additionally, there were splashes on the cement floor around the bed and on the walls. The latter matched Ayla's height. An expert determined that some drops were the size of a dime, indicative of trauma from a blunt object. Additionally, the experts determined that some blood spatter patterns in the house might have been expelled by Ayla through coughing, indicating that her injuries were both internal and external. The police stated that bed linens had been used to clean the girl's blood. It was horrific for Trista and her family to learn these details, and they hadn't seen everything yet. The same officers exposing the gruesome evidence warned them that they were about to witness something even more horrifying. Luminol tests were conducted in the house, revealing blood traces invisible to the naked eye. The slides taken at the house devastated Trista. After seeing them, she left the police station in a panic. She was more convinced than ever that her daughter, Ayla, had been murdered. The police said there were more images to show her, but she refused to see them. She'd had enough. Reportedly, when the police showed Justin and the DiPietro family the same photographic evidence months before, he showed no reaction. The police also tried to show the photos to the family with whom the DiPietro stayed during their exile from their house while it was being processed by crime scene investigators. They refused. They were not interested. Justin's girlfriend, Courtney, who was with Justin on the night of the disappearance, had the same reaction. After confronting the compelling police findings, Trista told the press amid her unbearable pain and helplessness that Justin, Elisha, and Courtney were still walking the streets as if nothing had happened. 8 months after receiving the dramatic report in September 2013, Trista wrote an explosive letter to the press about the evidence and the photos she had been shown. She was tired of waiting and, with or without law enforcement's blessing, she wanted to rekindle public interest in the case. In spring 2016, a team of journalists went to Justin's mother's house. Elisha, Ayla's aunt, answered the door, and the journalist asked about the blood evidence. She explained that Ayla was lactose intolerant and had been vomiting. However, a quick internet search showed that common symptoms of lactose intolerance are gas, bloating, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. While nausea and vomiting are listed, they are not the most common symptoms, let alone vomiting blood. In 2017, at Trista's request, a judge finally declared Ayla legally dead. The magistrate ruled that the death occurred around December 17, 2011, when she was reported missing by her father, Justin. With that resolution in hand, Trista and her lawyers filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Justin, alleging he caused Ayla's death through intentional unlawful acts and subjected the girl to pain prior to death, fear, terror, and physical injuries. At the time the lawsuit was filed, the subject was missing, and it was later learned that he and his lawyers denied any wrongdoing and labeled the lawsuit baseless. Faced with this, Trista decided to hold a press conference in which she addressed her dead daughter's father directly, asking him if he had any conscience.
I can see it in your eyes. And you know that's the problem. You look at me and you're gonna, I know you care.
Just say something, man.
Please, Justin.
Earlier this year, 2023, a judge approved Trista's petition to include Phoebe and Elisha in the wrongful death lawsuit. The three defendants are facing civil charges for wrongful death, conscious pain and suffering, and unlawful interference with the body of a deceased person. Additionally, Justin faces a charge for breaching a parent's duty to care for a minor child. Both Trista and her lawyer knew that they would not receive any financial compensation from Justin. That wasn't the goal of the lawsuit. Their objective was to reveal information and uncover the truth. There were so many strange things about Ayla's disappearance. For example, investigators told Trista something astonishing about the morning Ayla disappeared. Before calling 911, Justin drove to Portland and back. He claimed he thought Trista had taken Ayla and was looking for her, but he never called her or any of her family members. However, during that long trip, he did call his friend, who had sold him a $25,000 life insurance policy for Ayla a few weeks before. The weird thing is that Justin stayed at this friend's house while detectives advanced the investigations after the disappearance. This action was astonishing, considering that Justin stayed out of his baby's life during the 9 months of pregnancy and most of the child's existence. Trista also revealed having received strange messages from Justin in the week following the day he took Ayla. He mentioned being afraid that someone would try to kidnap her or snatch her away. The last time he said something similar was around December 11th, 6 days before the disappearance was reported. But when the child disappeared, those same messages became threatening and confusing. Trista said she had always wondered what those words meant. And well, that concludes today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, give a like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. See you soon. This is Unreal True Crime. It was November 2020 in a small town in Chile, and a 12-year-old girl named Melissa Chavez was sleeping peacefully. Melissa, known for her bright smile and strong spirit, had faced a lot of tough times in her life. That night, she finally fell asleep easily, feeling safe and comfortable in her bed. What she didn't know was that this night was different. It was quiet and calm, but something was not right. This would be her last night, and the quiet around her was hiding the sad truth that her days of playing and laughing were about to end. Melissa Chavez was born in 2008 in the city of Coquimbo, Chile. She was the youngest child of Mirta Ardil and Denny Chavez, who already had 3 children. Although Mirta and Denny were really nice people, the couple decided to separate shortly after Melissa's birth after 8 years together. However, Melissa's paternal family continued to stay in touch with her. Her aunt, Gina Chavez, had a special affection for her and was always concerned for her well-being. To support her household as a single mother, Mirta worked various jobs, including in a bar. It was there she became very close friends with Maria Teresa Caballero, a co-worker. Almost every night after closing the bar, Maria would head to another nearby bar to work extra hours and earn more money. Since Mirta often accompanied her wherever she went, she eventually found employment at that place as well. One night, while Mirta was working at the bar, a regular customer approached her. His name was Luis. Although details about his life are scarce, it is known he was born in 1981, worked in a mine in Antofagasta, and lived with his then partner. This first encounter led to a romance that neither Luis's ongoing relationship nor their age difference, with Mirta being 8 years his senior, could prevent. Eventually, Luis left his partner and moved in with Mirta by the year 2010, when Melissa was just 2 years old. By this time, Melissa's reserved nature was already evident, a trait that did not change much as she grew older. When she started school, she was kind but clearly found it hard to socialize and had few friends. Her shyness extended towards Luis, whom she saw as a stranger. However, in 2012, when her mother and he welcomed their first child together, the new sibling helped Melissa to start accepting Luis into her life. From that point forward, he also took on a role in her upbringing, offering her affection and care as if she were his own daughter. In turn, she began to refer to him as her father. This dynamic continued for a while, allowing Melissa to experience something she had almost never had, a sense of a home without fractures. But in 2014, Luis's behavior towards her changed. Everything occurred one afternoon when he was looking after her while Mirta was at work. Just then, without warning, what had always been merely affectionate treatment turned into inappropriate touching. Melissa first confided in one of her older sisters and only afterward alerted her mother. Around the same time, the girl was seen by her school's psychologist, to whom she also revealed what had happened. Faced with the alarming disclosure and the need to act to protect the girl, the news was communicated to the school's principal. She reached out to Mirta, and knowing how serious the situation was, the psychologist and they went to talk to the authorities. A complaint was filed through the psychologist and the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office immediately opened a case, and as a result, the courts decided to revoke the mother's custody of her daughter. Initially, it was thought that temporary custody would be given to the biological father. However, at that time, his situation was far from ideal. On the contrary, he was suffering from deep depression and struggling with alcoholism. As such, Melissa was placed in the care of her Aunt Gina. As for Mirta, in October 2014, the same court referred her to a family court program. The goal was to subject her to psychological and psychiatric assessments. Last but not least, to regain custody of her daughter, she was required to separate from Luis. During the process, she assured the authorities that she had indeed left him. However, the reality was that she was still in contact with him secretly. After 17 months, in March 2016, following supposed new evaluations that concluded Myrta was capable of resuming personal care of her daughter, the Child Protection Agency of Coquimbo returned the custody to her. Once Melissa was back home with her, the woman also took Luis back. Not content with having the girl and the aggressor live under the same roof, Myrta went to the authorities to retract the complaints against him. Since then, the agencies closed the investigation and did not follow up on the case. Several years passed with no records of any irregular events. It's unknown whether they didn't occur or were hidden. Thus, when September 2020 arrived, Myrta and Luis moved with Melissa and her younger brother to a 2-story house. The idea was to rebuild their lives in a calmer environment. Melissa, who was 12 years old at the time, had started secondary school and was in the 7th grade. As her mother had noticed, she was becoming a more independent young lady, which was evident, for example, in her long stays alone in her room, almost always listening to music. Sleeping in was another thing she enjoyed. And while she occasionally complained that her mother was too strict and demanding, overall, Melissa seemed content in the new neighborhood. But just then, Luis sought to resume the inappropriate behavior towards her, which had been suspended after the whole ordeal caused by the initial complaint. This time, fully aware of what was happening, Myrta chose to pretend nothing was happening. She didn't even make a complaint to protect her daughter. Instead, she often felt really jealous because Luis paid more attention to Melissa. The morning of November 26, 2020 proceeded with complete normality as everyone prepared to leave the house. But before that, Luis entered the teenager's room and, unlike previous instances, completed the act in its entirety. After the abuse, he left Melissa lying on her bed, devoid of any desire to move, deeply sad and ashamed. Around 10:30 that morning, Luis and his son left the house and took a taxi they had ordered in advance through an app. The sequence was recorded by the area's security cameras. While they were going to a vaccination day at the Sun School in the city center, Myrta was losing the battle against her inner demons. Alone with her daughter at home, the woman took a knife from the kitchen and went upstairs to Melissa's bedroom. At that time, the girl had succumbed to sleep amidst tears and despair. Once in front of her, her mother attacked her, causing multiple injuries that left her agonizing. Then, Myrta sent text messages to her dentist to arrange an appointment. Afterward, she returned to Melissa's room and set fire to the lower part of the bed, where the young girl had already lost all signs of life. It was just after 11 a.m. when closed-circuit cameras recorded her leaving the home. After stopping at a store to withdraw money, Myrta took a taxi she had ordered and went to her dental appointment. Once again, her movements were captured by cameras. Barely 7 minutes after her departure, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the house and contacted emergency services. Meanwhile, Luis and his son, on their way back, saw the fire truck speeding past them. As they approached their home, Luis could see the firefighters struggling to control the flames engulfing his house. Shocked and incredulous, he called Myrta. She confirmed that she had left Melissa sleeping. Upon receiving this information, his distress was uncontrollable, so much so that he even tried to enter, but the authorities prevented him. Meanwhile, neighbors tried to offer support and calm him down. Once the team managed to partially control the fire, they identified that it had originated in one of the bedrooms. Upon entering, they found Melissa's lifeless body, which had not been completely consumed by the fire. Initially, rescuers suggested that smoke inhalation might have been the cause of her death. As for Myrta, she returned home, ready to pretend. Already notified of the tragedy, both she and Luis appeared devastated in front of the neighbors and the television cameras present. Unaware of the truth, Luis demanded justice, stating, "The person responsible, they're going to have to pay. They will have to pay for everything they did." Once Melissa's remains were transferred to the morgue, the investigation at the scene continued, and investigators collected some kitchen utensils and other items from the house for further analysis. Early findings led to the initial hypothesis of death by smoke inhalation being dismissed, and the possibility of third-party involvement began to gain traction. In the preliminary autopsy report, forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds. While the prosecutor requested to wait for the final results, the information somehow leaked, and soon neighbors took to the streets demanding justice for Melissa and expressing their fear of a criminal loose in the area. After the forensic analyses were completed, and while waiting for the detailed and definitive report, Melissa's body was released to her family for the wake and subsequent burial. At the funeral, Mirta urged anyone with relevant information to cooperate in the search for the truth and clarification of the case. Visibly affected, Luis did the same. However, suspicions were directed at the victim's mother, especially considering she had been the last to leave the house on that fateful day. Others claimed to have seen an older man leaving just before the smoke was noticed. This last theory was convenient for Mirta, who clung to it. However, upon reviewing the security cameras around the house, investigators found no evidence of the alleged presence of this individual. Therefore, they decided to pause this line of inquiry while continuing to search for new clues. Meanwhile, since their involvement could not be entirely ruled out, Luis and Mirta were summoned as suspects. On that occasion, both repeated their version of events. Additionally, their cell phones were made available to the authorities. Shortly after, the autopsy results confirmed the severity of the attack Melissa suffered, which, according to forensic doctors, would not have been fatal had she received timely medical help. The detectives in charge of the case revealed chilling details, confirming she suffered cranioencephalic trauma and had 11 sharp force injuries. The worst part was that they estimated she had agonized for approximately an hour. Recent sexual abuse was also indicated by injuries, but no genetic material could be retrieved. From that moment, Luis became a focus for the prosecutor, who could not ignore the 2014 precedent. Meanwhile, chemical tests performed on the seized utensils found traces of the victim's and her mother's DNA, particularly on the knife used in the attack. The prosecutor's office revealed crucial details about this evidence. The knife used in the attack had a distinctive tip damage, matching the injuries and fractures on the teenager's skull. Moreover, it wasn't just that the mother's and daughter's DNA was found, but where it was located. According to the Legal Medical Service, Melissa's genetic material was on the blade, and a significant genetic fingerprint of Mirta was on the handle. Chemical tests also showed that after being used as a weapon, it was washed to remove blood traces. With all this evidence supporting a case beyond reasonable doubt, on February 2, 2021, Mirta was arrested as the alleged perpetrator of the crime. Later, the police provided details including their knowledge of the events. At the formalization hearing, the public prosecutor charged Mirta with the crime of homicide. After presenting a video that evidenced the chronology of the event, the prosecutor pointed out the absence of eyewitnesses, the mother's attempt to erase all evidence, and the short span between her departure and the smoke sighting. In summary, for the public prosecutor, it was a passionate and ferocious crime. Although the defense insisted on her innocence, the prosecutor dismissed the idea outright. During the investigation, Mirta was held in preventive detention for 6 months. However, The public prosecutor's office still needed to investigate the nature of the relationship between Luis and the minor. Aware of his precarious situation, Luis fled. Despite authorities' efforts to locate him, neither relatives nor friends had any information about his whereabouts. In parallel, a multitude of neighbors and family members expressed their condemnation of Mirta, demanding justice for Melissa, while the house became a symbol of commemoration and protest. Mirta's defense attorney challenged the decision to keep her detained during the investigation period. But on February 10th, the Court of Appeals confirmed the preventive detention measure against Mirta. One of the most affected was obviously Gina Melissa's paternal aunt. Amid her grief, she criticized the failures of a system that, in her opinion, did not adequately follow up with the family or verify that the mother was qualified to regain custody. She was particularly outraged that the authorities had not ensured Mirta and Luis's separation. Eventually, the various efforts to locate Luis yielded results on Wednesday, November 17, 2021, when he was discovered in the upper area of Coquimbo. He was handed over to justice, facing charges for repeated abuses of a minor. The next day, the defendant was made available to the Court of Guarantees. During the hearing, the prosecution presented further details of the crimes he had committed against Melissa. After hearing the arguments of the prosecution, ordered preventive detention for Luis and his admission to jail, arguing that releasing him posed a danger to society. Meanwhile, on November 29th, the prosecution formally charged Mirta and added a new charge for being an accomplice to the sexual crimes committed by her partner against her daughter. Nearly a year later, on September 23, 2022, the investigation's closing hearing took place. That day, the arguments of the parties to justify continuing the trial highlighted the testimonies of fellow inmates from the penitentiary where Mirta was held in preventive detention. They pointed out that Mirta dedicated all her time to taking care of her appearance and never showed remorse or sadness for how she had acted against her own daughter. They also presented a psychological profile of the accused, indicating to the court that she did not understand empathy but was very familiar with manipulation, as she had provided details and information from the beginning to distort her actions and divert suspicions that arose around her. They stated that Mirta was a person with a preserved reality judgment, aware of the illegality of her acts and the consequences of her actions. This made her culpable as she presented a personality disorder but no loss of contact with reality. Awaiting trial, the regional prosecutor announced he would request life imprisonment for Mirta. For Luis, he would seek a sentence of more than 20 years in prison. On January 21, 2023, just before the trial began, Mirta was urgently transferred from jail to the hospital due to complications from kidney stones. Her hospitalization became public through a photo leaked on social media, prompting criticism from the defense team for the lack of privacy for their client. 3 days after a successful operation, she was discharged and returned to prison. Given the extreme gravity of the events and the fact that they involved a minor, the Child Rights Defense Office requested that the hearings be conducted without media presence. During the last preparatory hearing for the trial, the defense attorney focused on the absence of genetic material to dismiss the accusations against Luis. Ultimately, considering the evidence presented by the public prosecutor's office insufficient, the court dismissed the charges, and instead of preventive detention, Luis was placed under house arrest with a prohibition on leaving the country. Despite this decision, he still had to face a trial. Mirta was not as fortunate. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the highest judicial authority determined she should remain in preventive detention. The trial for Melissa's case took place on April 23, 2023. Presenting a detailed chronology of the events leading to the tragic outcome, the prosecutor asserted that all evidence pointed unequivocally to Mirta, a woman whose jealousy led her to see a rival in her own daughter. To support her case, security camera footage was exhibited in court. The defense criticized what they considered a lack of thoroughness in the investigation, arguing that other leads that could have led to the real culprit and not Mirta were not sufficiently explored. The defense attorneys requested that the court consider their client's substantial cooperation since the beginning of the investigation, initially as witnesses and later as defendants. They proposed a sentence of 10 years for homicide and 5 for arson for Mirta, and a 3-year and 1-day prison sentence for Luis. However, both the public prosecutor and the case advocates opposed all the requests. On May 17, 2023, in a unanimous decision, the court found Luis and Mirta guilty of the charged crimes. Following the verdict, the prosecutors thanked the support of civil society and the entities involved in the investigation, including the experts from the forensic laboratory. On May 27, 2023, the court sentenced Mirta to 33 years in prison, 18 for homicide, and 15 for being the author of a consummated arson. Luis Santander was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day for repeated sexual abuse of Melissa Chavez and was prohibited from engaging in activities involving minors. The case deeply shocked Chilean society, and though the sentences could not reverse the irreparable loss of Melissa and the life she could have had, they brought some consolation to the community with the effective action of the judiciary. Dear viewers, this concludes today's story. Remember to subscribe and leave a like to let me know you appreciate my work. Good night. Traveling through a trail for 2 hours, the police reached the location. Arcadio Alvarez was found in a sugarcane field. It was at that moment that they apprehended the suspect, who was accused of committing incest for about 30 years against his eldest daughter, Alba Nidia, with whom he had at least 14 children, of which 8 survived. Very little is known about the childhood and youth of Arcadio Alvarez. We know that at some point during his youth, he formed a relationship with a woman whose identity has not been disclosed, and with whom he had a daughter. It appears that his partner died in 1979, and he was left to care for the little girl, who was then 5 years old. The girl's name was Alba Nidia Alvarez, who later became known as Nidia. After the death of his life partner, Arcadio moved into the home of a relative, an aunt of Nidia's, though it was unclear whether she was his sister or the sister of his deceased wife. However, a few years later, Arcadio began to encounter problems in that house, which is unsurprising, as the man started to abuse his daughter. This inappropriate behavior began when she was 5 years old. When she was around 13 years old, Nidia gave birth to her first baby, a boy who was also her brother. For her, this situation was always a tragedy, but her father was indifferent to it. They eventually settled with his family in a small village very far from everything in the south of Colombia, where only the most basic services were available. There were barely 200 families living in the area. Arcadio was a farmer with very few resources. As a result of his precarious economic situation, upon arriving at the place, He settled his family in a fragile and unstable wooden house with a zinc roof and dirt floors. It is noteworthy that by the time Arcidio arrived in that area, the family had 4 children. For the people of the region, initially, nothing seemed too strange. They simply saw the newcomers as good people, even though they were not very sociable or communicative. Nydia was a very reserved young lady and did not socialize with the local residents. In fact, she never left the house unless she was with her father, and she was essentially only seen when going out to buy supplies for the family alongside Arcidio. Some were concerned that she was school-age but did not attend the public school in the town. However, they never inquired about the reasons why the father did not send her to school. One day, reality struck everyone when it became evident that Nydia was pregnant. If she didn't leave the house, didn't have a boyfriend, and her father exercised complete control over her eldest daughter, the only possible conclusion was that the young girl, while a minor, was being abused by her father. But even though the abuse situation was clear to everyone, no one spoke. By the time Nydia was over 20 years old, she had had 11 pregnancies, not all of which came to term, and not all of the babies born survived. Nydia never gave birth in a hospital. It was often up to someone else to help her bring into the world the children fathered by Arcidio. In the small town, everyone gossiped about this. Initially, they were horrified, but nobody said anything. Of the 14 children Arcidio and his daughter Nydia had, in the end, only 8 survived, 3 girls and 5 boys. Only Nydia learned to read and write because her father taught her. The rest had all their rights violated, starting with the right to an identity, since they were never legally registered. It was as if they did not exist. Without an essential document like the birth certificate, they could never enroll in the small local school that around 80 children attended, nor were they vaccinated or treated at the local clinic. Local inhabitants later reported that they saw the irregular couple when they went out shopping and never noticed any affectionate relationship between them. Some neighbors claimed they had the chance to talk with Nydia, but instead of offering help or some kind of support to get out of the situation in which she was the victim, they blamed her. They told her that having intimacy and children with her father was not right. Her response was always to remain silent. No one ever dared to confront Arcidio or reproach his misconduct. Later, some neighbors claimed that while he seemed like a decent man, he was extremely serious, and the people feared he might do something to them. Over time, the forbidden carnal relationship between relatives became something everyone started to accept as normal in the locality. Apparently, on a few occasions, the Alvarez's home was visited by personnel from the local Secretary of Education and the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, as well as representatives of the Catholic and evangelical churches. The goal of all was to motivate the parents to send the kids to school, but this never had any effect. To make matters worse, these organizations also failed to pay attention to the fact that the children were not legally registered. It seemed that at that moment, the wind was blowing in Arcidio's favor. However, Arcidio pushed the limits too far, and that was the beginning of the end of his sinister plan of subjugation and abuse to the detriment of his entire family. As Nydia later recounted, her father began to show interest in perpetuating his deviant behavior with at least one of his granddaughters, who was around 11 years old. And as if his immoral behavior wasn't enough, he began to insinuate to his older male children that they could do the same. This undoubtedly set off alarms for Nydia, and it could be said that a divine intervention paved the way to the end. Around that time, Orlando, a pastor from the Pentecostal church, spoke to those present at one of his sermons, including Arcidio, who wanted to appear as a correct and faithful man, about the topic of incest and what it meant, labeling it as a terrible sin. This was a turning point in Nydia's life, who, at the end of the meeting, approached the pastor to ask him to pray for her. But the stars were aligning, as around that time, the world learned about the terrible case of Elisabeth Fritzl in Austria, whose father, Joseph Fritzl, kept her captive in the basement of his own house for 24 years, fathering 7 children with her. The case of Elisabeth was so shocking that it seemed people around the world were willing to prevent such situations from being repeated. It was this story that propelled Nydia to make a definitive decision. Also, religious conviction that her father was forcing her to commit a sin, and the fear that one of her daughters could become a victim of the same man added to the need to protect her descendants from the father's brutal assaults. The man, who always had a hellish temperament, beat one of his 6-year-old sons for waking him from his nap by fighting with one of his sisters. That, apparently, was the last straw. At that moment, Nydia confronted her father who, as he always had, reacted by hitting her. This was the strategy the man had used for years to ensure obedience through fear. But this time was different. Fueled by rage and courage, Nydia fought back, something that surprised Arcidio. Nydia knew she had no other option but to leave that house. For that, she not only gathered courage but also had the full support of her older daughters. Trusting in God's will and with the strength gained from her conversations with the pastor at the first opportunity, Nydia took her 6 youngest children and fled the humble house that had been her prison. The 2 oldest male children, 18 and 16 years old at that time, chose to stay with their father. The group left and headed to a nearby town, where Nydia took some time to settle her family before formally filing a complaint against her father with the authorities. Initially, she only dared to accuse him of having beaten her young son, but later she expanded the complaint to detail the years of abuse she herself had been a victim of. Clearly, before taking any action, the authorities had to conduct an investigation to corroborate the serious accusations Nydia had made. Meanwhile, her 6 children depended solely on her, and they were in a different town where rent had to be paid. But if there was something Nydia was an expert at, it was working hard, so it didn't take too long before she found a job at a local restaurant. She worked exhausting shifts, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 8 at night. She devoted 15 hours of her life daily, from Sunday to Sunday, to the demanding job that barely earned her 7,000 pesos, less than $4 at that time. In the meantime, her eldest daughter, 16 years old, took care of her siblings and became the most important support for the suffering mother. However, the authorities who heard Nydia did not make much effort to investigate what happened, and valuable time was lost for the woman and her children in terms of receiving the support they were justly entitled to from the Colombian state. The first to take real action on the complaint was a family commissioner who, seeing that the case was not being properly addressed, decided to send the information to Hugo Parra, a close collaborator of a counselor. Months had passed after the first complaint was made when Hugo, representing the counselor, arrived at the house occupied by Nydia and her children to learn firsthand what had happened. The man was completely shocked. As Hugo later told the media that covered the story, Nydia and her children were living in extreme poverty. The house they inhabited was in terrible condition, lacking clean water. The smell was almost unbearable. And of Nydia, only her shadow remained, as the 35-year-old woman looked almost 70. At that moment, it was decided to make the case public knowledge and to start a strict follow-up of the progress of the complaint. The following months were dedicated to gathering testimonies that would attest to the truthfulness of Nydia's accusations. Finally, in January 2009, it was considered that there were sufficient elements to present the case to the General Attorney of the nation. Immediately, the highest authority of the public ministry ordered a group of detectives to start investigating the facts officially and in depth. The impunity that Arcidio had enjoyed came to an end on March 27, 2009. That day, agents of the investigation team, known by its initials as CTI, initiated an operation to capture the alleged perpetrator. They had to travel 2 hours through intricate paths to reach the sugarcane plantation where Arsadio was known to be. Finally, the 58-year-old man was detained. In his initial statement to the authorities after being arrested, Arsadio maintained that he had never forced Nidia to engage in inappropriate sexual relations and also asserted that she was not his biological daughter but had been adopted. Needless to say, he also denied having intentions of abusing his daughters, much less having instigated his older sons to do so. Upon hearing her father's statements, Nidia affirmed that he used the same argument of her supposed adoption to abuse her. She added that her father subjected her to the most terrible treatments, besides having her practically imprisoned since she lived locked up and could not go anywhere unless it was with him. Among everything, perhaps the most surprising was when she claimed that he would always be her father and as such, she had to respect him. She then detailed that she always maintained in her conversations with Arsadio, when trying to reason with him, that she loved him as a father and never saw him as a man. On March 28, 2009, the trial against Arsadio Alvarez took place. There, the abuser maintained his version that Nidia was not his biological daughter but an adopted one, and stated that the two had agreed to love each other. What he could not explain was how he could have made such an agreement with a girl of 5 years old, which was the age she was when he violated her for the first time. Following this hearing, Arsadio was transferred to the local jail amidst a crowd gathered at the courthouse gates to shout insults at the abuser. The police had to act quickly to remove him from the place, as many in the crowd wanted to physically assault him. The detainee was charged with sexual abuse, violent carnal access, and incest against his daughter Alba Nidia Alvarez. By that time, the case had become well known, and the press had given it full attention. Despite everything Nidia had suffered, she showed her enormous heart as a mother during her conversation with journalists. She always stated that her greatest fear during all those years of subjugation was that her children might become victims of assaults like she was. Nidia maintained that this was something she never allowed, and she also stated that every interaction with her father made her feel very bad, and she did not want the story to repeat with her daughters, a point she had made very clear to Arsadio, warning him that if he ever laid a hand on any of her daughters, that would be the end of the docile and good person he had known. She hinted in her interaction with the media that she also resented that what was happening to her was an open secret and no one offered her the least bit of support. She confirmed that she never gave birth in a health center. All her childbirths were attended by midwives at home who knew the situation, but only asked if the new baby was the child of the same father. By that time, her oldest child was 19 years old, and the youngest was only 1 year old. In 2009, the trial against Arsadio ended, with no further details found, except, of course, that in response to the accused's claims that Nidia was not his biological daughter, comparative DNA tests were ordered. The Colombian Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed that the man was lying, as the tests proved she was indeed his daughter. It was also revealed that the prosecution originally tried to add an additional charge for sexual acts against a minor under 14 years of age for an alleged abuse against one of his daughters, but the fact could never be proven, and in the end, the prosecution dropped this charge. The media reported that in the initial session, Arsadio pleaded innocent, but after 12 hours of hearing Nidia's valuable testimony and the DNA evidence, the accused ended up accepting the charges against him and even apologized to his daughter and his grandchildren. With his admission of guilt in October 2009, the presiding judge sentenced Arsadio Alvarez to 15 years and 7 months in prison, a sentence that undoubtedly seemed almost an offense to the victims and did not take into account the number of people whose lives were severely affected. And there was yet another incomprehensible detail. Although the reasons were not found, the sentence was later reduced to 11 years, 7 months, and some days. After the trial and under the protection of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, Nydia and her 6 younger children were relocated and placed in a house in good condition in Bogotá, the country's capital, with the aim of starting a new life away from the place where everyone knew them and would constantly remind them of what had happened. This is the last information that could be found about this family. And talking about Arcidio, the insufficient sentence was not even fully served. As in 2011, the authorities of that institution reported that Arcidio had died. According to a press release issued by the prison authorities 2 weeks before, the individual had been hospitalized for surgery due to gallstones. But the day after being discharged and returned to prison, the guards found him dead in his cell. The report stated that the death occurred due to natural causes. At the end of this case, the lesson of Nydia's courage and her struggle to provide for her surviving children remained. But the undeniable pain of so many years and the deaths of 6 little ones, either because their pregnancies did not come to term or due to being born under inadequate conditions, was undoubtedly very difficult to overcome. At the time of the events, the director of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare stated that he had never known a case of this magnitude in Colombia and expressed concern that a situation of so many years had not been denounced by anyone. The official was not only referring to a complaint from the victim, who was the most fragile and had the least opportunity to do so, but also to the community members who knew about the situation but chose to remain silent. In a conversation with the press, one of the sons who stayed with the father tried to make sense of the events from his humble point of view. But the truth is that nothing justifies what happened in this case. Nydia lived for about 30 years dreaming for freedom, but without the courage to obtain it, as the abuse started at such a young age that it left her unable to defend herself. Inside, she was a terrified child, even at the age of 30. After finally being freed from her abusive father, the woman stated that all that went through her mind was the hope that her children could have a better future, that they would study to progress in life, form their homes, and feel at peace. And perhaps the great lesson of this case is advice for other women that Nydia repeated several times to the media. She pointed out that if they found themselves in a similar situation, they should find a way to speak out, to denounce, and trust in God to move forward. For Nydia, silence was her father's perfect accomplice, not just her own silence, but that of all those who, knowing the situation, preferred to look the other way. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.